Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are going to be finishing our lecture series on the battles itself. We still have a few other lectures after this to kind of wrap things up and take a look at some of the smaller, nuanced parts of this war. But today is going to be an end to the fighting. We're going to see the Americans prevail with the help of the French, and we will see the largest empire in the world, the most powerful military in the world, come to a screeching halt to a bunch of farmers with pitchforks, right? But hopefully by now we know that that's not necessarily the case. So anyways, we are going to jump into it. As a reminder, guys, please make sure you are taking notes as we wrap up the lecture series here, and I will communicate with you guys about assessments in the near future. Okay, let's go ahead and get to the lecture itself. All right, so I want to remind you that last time we spoke, we talked about the Northern Theater, and most of the early fighting was happening up north. So, we talked a lot about New York City, New Jersey. There was a lot of fighting in New Jersey, Princeton, Trenton. The armies have kind of been dancing around, and we've really haven't seen too much success out of Washington's Continental Army. They have had some key victories, some morale-boosting victories, but last we saw them, they are holed up in Valley Forge, and they are struggling to simply survive. Well, now that the French are involved, the British understand that this is going to change the war. And so in 1778, they begin a new strategy, and that is to focus more on the South. The idea was that if you were able to take over the South, kind of make that your headquarters, because they felt the population was more loyal to them, that there were more loyalist population in that area. We're going to find out that, honestly, they were wrong about that, and frankly, a much more spread out geographic area, it's going to be much harder for them to fight. But that doesn't mean that the British weren't without their victories in the South. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, every day, as I said, the French are getting closer and closer. So the British are kind of recentering their efforts here in the South. Now, again, with this survey course, guys, we're not talking about all the major battles. There's constant fighting going on, but constant movement of armies. But we are going to talk about some of those key southern battles and cities that were taken here. So the first one I want to mention, 1778, December, Savannah, Georgia. This would be attacked by the British, and later on, you will have an American/French force come to liberate it and defend it in October 79. But Savannah was one of the first places hit. Now, remember, Georgia had not been, a real big part of the proceedings up to the war. Remember, they were really on the frontier in the South there, and so the British kind of start there thinking that if anybody was going to be on their side, it's going to be Georgia. But ultimately, they take hold for the city for just a short period. Now, the big one I want you to know is the Siege of Charleston, and this is going to have some major repercussions even at the end of the war. So the Siege of Charleston takes place from March to May, and focus on that word siege there, okay? So just like in the Middle Ages, where you would have an army surround a town or a village and lay siege to it. No one gets in, no one gets out. That's what's happening here over this period. So the British head down to Charleston. They are outmanning the Americans 2-1. Okay, the British show up with 13,000 men. The Americans have 7,000 men, and that doesn't even necessarily take into account the naval action that's happening. So the British are able to use the Navy to surround Charleston by water. Ultimately, the British are going to be able to capture 5,300 American prisoners. In addition to just the prisoners, they're actually able to capture all the weaponry that's in Charleston as well. So there's about 311, that's very specific, 311 artillery pieces that the British capture, 6,000 muskets, and 49 ships that are captured. Now, the American Navy, which had just been founded, was not very big. This is a huge armada, basically the bulk of our Navy. This is a huge moment, where the British, it kind of looks like maybe momentum's going to them. Effectively, the Continental Army in the South is defeated at this point. This was the bulk of their forces. And, it's not like you can just mass produce guns very quickly. Losing 6,000 muskets, over 300 artillery pieces, that's devastating for the American forces there. One interesting note about this is that after the battle starts to come to an end, after the siege begins to come to an end in May of 1780, the British deny the kind of war honors. And this is kind of getting into that whole culture of respect. And basically what was commonplace at the time was, in this situation where especially you had laid siege for so long, the defending army would be allowed to basically exit, okay, respectively. They would be able to exit, in rows, often playing music, waving the flag. They are denied those surrendering honors of war. And Washington would remember this, okay? When he hears about the fact that they were just basically treated as criminals, he does remember this, and frankly, later on at Yorktown, the last major engagement, when we defeat the British, he denies them those honors. In fact, let me read you a quick quote. And he defended this action. He said that the British would receive, quote, "the same honors will be granted to the surrendering army as were granted to the garrison of Charlestown." This was a huge insult to the American side, that the British would deny them even just the simplest respect of being able to exit with their heads raised high. But as I said, this is a major moment because it does look as if the strategy is paying off for the British. They are able to capture a major port town and effectively ruin the Continental Army in the South. All right, moving on. Let's see if I can get my cursor. There we go. Okay. So, again, we're going to hit some major battles here. We're not even talking about all of them. I wish we had time to do that. But these are the ones that I found to be, the most important. And, again, for each one, we're not going to go into full detail, but I will kind of highlight what I consider to be the most important element from each battle. Now, the next major one up is the Battle of Camden, August of 1780. Now, in this battle, Lieutenant General Charles and Lord Cornwallis basically routed the American forces led by Major General Horatio Gates. This was a shocking British victory because they were outnumbered 2-1. The Americans actually had the numerical advantage, but that is not always a predictor of who will win. So although Gates, who we talked about as being the hero of Saratoga, that real turning point in the war, the proving that the Americans could actually defend this land. Now all of a sudden, Gates, who had numerical advantage, is defeated and he's disgraced. So that had been a high point for him at Saratoga, but quickly followed up at Camden. He leaves in disgrace. In fact, he will never command troops in the field again. Camden is his last battle, and he will actually be replaced. The Southern Army that still exists is handed over to Major General Nathaniel Greene, and he is going to shift the strategy of the American forces in the South, the Continental forces, I should say. There's not really an American army. It's a Continental army. So Nathaniel Greene replaces Gates, and he is going to change the strategy, and this is one of the big important items from the Battle of Camden. So the strategy that the Americans begin to follow is a strategy of attrition. Okay, we talked about that a little bit with Washington, but it's going to be used even more heavily in the South here. So what Nathaniel Greene's going to do is basically kind of pick and choose his moments. They are going to kind of go on the run, make sure that they avoid the big battles with the British and be able to attack them only when they have superior numbers, although as we just saw in Camden, that doesn't always mean victory, but basically wait until they have what they feel is the advantage to attack. Okay, they don't want one big battle to decide it all. They're going to kind of go on the run and force the British, who is constantly struggling to keep supplies to their army. You think about the logistics. We hardly ever talk about the logistics of warfare, but as the British are getting deeper and deeper into the Carolinas, where are they getting food? Where are they getting, for every bullet, musket fired, where are they getting, resupplies? That's not a very easy feat. So Greene realizes if we can drag this thing out, especially now that the French are on their way, we'll have the advantage. Okay, so that is a very positive tactic, and it's going to work well for us. Moving on to the Battle of Kings Mountain, October 1780. What's important about this battle is that it actually wasn't fought by two armies at all. In fact, this was fought by American militias on both sides. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, you had a Patriot militia going up against a Loyalist militia. So a little bit different. This was a surprise attack. The Patriot Army surrounded and defeated the American Loyalists. And although they quickly withdrew because Cornwallis was kind of right there on their tail with the larger British army, the Battle of Kings Mountain is a great example of the use of surprise attacks and attrition. Okay, so being able to launch this surprise attack on the Loyalists, defeat them, and then basically leave before the larger army can get there. Great example of attrition. So, if you're answering a question about strategies in the used in the war, Battle of Kings Mountain's a great one to use there as a piece of evidence. Number 4, the Battle of Cowpens, January 1781. This is one that needs to be highlighted, asterisks, however you want to do it. This is the turning point in the Southern campaign. The turning point in the Southern campaign. So not only did the Continental forces reclaim South Carolina, that's one of the big things from the British, but the battle resulted in many of the British regulars being killed, okay? And many of them had been here the entire fighting. So you basically have the British Army lose a lot of their veteran soldiers in this battle. They lose a lot of their leadership. So basically the best British soldiers are killed in the Battle of Cowpens. And so it was not only a strategic victory, but it was also a psychological victory for the Americans. The Americans will continue to push against the British, and basically the Battle of Cowpens is what caused the British to once again re-examine their strategy, and they kind of have to abandon the South at this point. So they're going to push back towards the middle colonies after the Battle of Cowpens. Now, a couple months after that, there would be another battle that took place in the South, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And this is what we call a Pyrrhic victory. Okay, I mentioned that term before, but a Pyrrhic victory for the British. So, reminder, a Pyrrhic victory is one in which you win, but it's so costly that it's almost like a loss, right? So for the British, they are able to win, but it's so devastating to their numbers that basically it would have been better had they just not engaged at all. Cornwallis has engaged Greene here after chasing him into North Carolina, but Cornwallis's army is so heavily damaged that he decides he is going to have to retreat, and he's going to basically have to kind of hold up until he can get refit for battle, he can get reinforcements, and he chooses a location that he thinks will be easily accessible by water to where he could get reinforced from New York, and that is a place called Yorktown. Now, we are reaching the end here. We've kind of quickly arrived. Hopefully you've been able to see this process as it's taken place throughout the South here. But Washington hears the results of Guilford Courthouse. He hears that Cornwallis in 1781 is making this move to Yorktown, and he decides this is the time to pounce. Washington, even though he's taken some beatings, he was a great commander in the field. He knew when to take advantage of the situation, and he is going to basically go down and meet Cornwallis at Yorktown, and he's going to take a wounded army, and he is going to take advantage of the situation. So this return, I say return to the north, really the middle colonies is kind of where we're focused on at the end here. So I mentioned Washington and Valley Forge. So very, very difficult time for the winter, being held up in the winter. But during that time, for the soldiers that were able to survive the winter, they are doing constant training and constant drilling. By this point, we have had some foreign actors make their way into America to help with that training. And I want to talk a little bit about this because we don't really get on this side of the fighting. So in particular, there were two guys, Baron von Steuben, they're pictured on the left. Okay, he was a Prussian officer. And he basically taught the kind of the essentials of military drill and tactics and discipline. So the Prussians had sent him over to aid the Americans because the Prussians had a poor relationship with the British as well. So Steuben, Baron von Steuben, helped Washington get those troops ready at Valley Forge and got them trained. The second and more famous of the two foreign officers that are helping with training, Marquis de Lafayette. Okay, and as you can probably tell from the name alone, he was a Frenchman. The French had sent him over earlier on. He has one of the most impressive lives I've ever come across in history. So he becomes an officer in the French army at the age of 13, okay? For the most people that are watching this, you are well past that age. So, think about being an officer in the army at the age of 13, basically as a freshman in high school or an 8th grader. He came to America because he believed that the cause that the Americans were fighting for was a noble cause, and he wanted to aid in that. This is the age of enlightenment, and these ideas of casting off the tradition of the old world, these were things that were starting to spread throughout the world, especially the Western world. And he recognized that the Americans are doing something that no country on earth has ever done, and that is try to throw off an imperial power in this manner. So, at least not in recent history. So he heads to America because he does believe in the cause of the fighting. By the age of 19 in America, he is given the rank of Major General, and he will actually spend time back and forth. He helps to rally the French to support the Americans, and he returns to America in 1780, and he is given a senior command in the Continental Army. Ultimately, it's going to be Lafayette with Washington at Yorktown, and he will help block Cornwallis until Washington basically arrives. So Lafayette is key and instrumental in making sure that Cornwallis stays in Yorktown. He's kind of the initial commander that surrounds it, and then ultimately Washington shows up with the bulk of the Continental forces, and we're able to win. So Lafayette is a very interesting character. So basically you have this training happening in the north while most of the fighting's happening in the south. And what that means is there's a tremendous increase in morale overall because the American Continental Army is much better trained than they were before Valley Forge, before winter quarters, and they are ready to prove that. All right, so our timeline's kind of shifted here as we kind of covered the whole Southern theater, so we're kind of going backwards just a little bit, but a couple of battles that I want to make sure we cover. First of all, the Battle of Monmouth, June 1778. So this takes place after Brandywine. This takes place after Philadelphia is occupied. At this point, General Clinton is ordered to protect New York in 1778. And Clinton had originally planned to take ocean transports, but there's a lack of ships, and basically the French are set to arrive any day. And so Clinton decides to take an overland route. Well, on June 18th, the British begin to evacuate Philadelphia. They're going to head towards New York. They have with them 11,000 British and German soldiers. We talked about those Hessians. They have 1,000 loyalists with them as well. And they are about to make this march. It's 100 miles. All right. I want you to think about logistically like what that must look like. Okay. To march 100 miles, first of all, exhausting. But second of all, some of these roads that these guys are taking, often very narrow. If you had 11,000 people, okay, in a line trying to march, think of the logistical problems that would create. This is going to get really dragged out, and again, the Americans are going to take advantage of this. So as they begin the slow march basically through New Jersey, the Americans, and many of which were just normal civilians, realizing that they could play a part here, they begin to do things to slow down the British advance, including burning bridges. Okay, they destroy bridges that caused this is, again, 200 years ago. It's not like if a bridge goes out, you can just, jump in a, barge and cross the river. I mean, you would have to find another way, and that's going to delay maybe even weeks. They do things like burn bridges. There's reports of people muddying wells. So again, you got to think the logistics, supplies for the soldiers. You got 11,000 guys marching. They're going to need water to march 100 miles. Well, as they come across wells, which is how most people got their water at the time, they find that they've basically been muddied to where it's undrinkable. And so that's another way they were able to slow down. Obstructing roads, they would fell trees and make sure that they blocked the roads. It's interesting to note here at the Battle of Monmouth that that normal citizens are actually playing a part. And I want to include the legend of Molly Pitcher. Her real name was Mary Hayes, but she becomes known in historical lore as Molly Pitcher. So the story basically goes as this. At the Battle of Monmouth, her husband was actually manning an artillery piece, and this was very common that, often families would follow the army around. And so Molly Pitcher was there, and during the extreme fighting that's going on, and also it was very hot. It was unusually hot. It's June. She began actually running water to soldiers throughout the battlefield, but she looks over and she noticed that her husband has fallen. He's been killed while manning the artillery gun. So she stops. She puts her pitcher down and she runs over and she begins to man the artillery piece and kind of pick up where her husband lay. Now, she really becomes one of these symbols of the fighting spirit, the spirit of 1776, in which normal, everyday citizens are willing to risk it all for the cause. So the legend of Molly Pitcher has always been one of my favorite stories. Well, that brings us to our final battle, and that is the Siege of Yorktown, September to October of 1781. The French show up just in time when Cornwallis is at his weakest. He has just made it to Yorktown. Lafayette has him pinned down, and then all of a sudden the French show up. I can't imagine how exhilarating it must have been to be a Continental soldier, to look out into the ocean and to see these hundreds of ships coming, waving the French flag, and how much horror that must have brought Cornwallis. Well, 5,000 Frenchmen land in Rhode Island to, first of all, take New York City. And then they basically continue down to Yorktown, where Cornwallis is trying to establish contact with New York. And in total, there's going to be 16,000 men that lay siege to Yorktown, to Cornwallis. That's twice the size of what Cornwallis has there at Yorktown. 8,000 men will surrender in October 1781. You have that picture in the bottom right, a famous painting showing the surrender of the British. So once Washington shows up and the siege continues, Cornwallis realizes that the French are controlling the waterways. Washington and Lafayette have him surrounded by land. That he has no option. He has to surrender. And so here you have one of the most famous British generals of all time, finally laying down his sword and surrendering. Well, this comes as a shocking blow to the British. How could they ever have gotten to this point? But I should note that, like in all wars, we'll talk about the same thing happening with the Civil War. Cornwallis represented the largest of the British armies, so there would be sporadic fighting that occurred after this. It's not like a telegram went out to everyone and all of a sudden they all laid down arms. There still had to be communication lag and whatnot. But the Battle of Yorktown is often seen as the last major battle because it is the bulk of the British forces that are surrendering. Well, that leaves peace to be settled at this point. By February 27th, 1782, the House of Commons, which very much like our House of Representatives, okay? Our Congress is set up. You got the House of Representatives, which kind of represents the people, and you have the Senate, which kind of is supposedly, more veteran politicians, wisdom, all that good stuff. The House of Commons votes in 1782 votes against continuing the war. And they basically meet about a week later, March 5th, 1782, and they authorize the Crown to make peace. So again, power lay with the Parliament here, and they basically decide to allow the Crown to make peace. It is organized, it's arranged that both parties would meet in September in Paris, and kind of not necessarily neutral, but France decides to kind of organize this peace treaty signing. So September 3rd, 1783, both parties agreed to meet, and they reached some very important negotiations here. So I want to review those and what's included in this Peace of Paris. So number one, first and foremost, the British do recognize U.S. independence. And by the way, before I begin this list, I do want to note that we are less than 30 years away. That sounds like a long time, but we're 29 years away from the War of 1812. Okay, we will fight the British again. All right, a lot of what leads to that war can be found right here. Okay, where the British are going to agree to a lot of things here, they don't necessarily follow up on them. So the British recognize U.S. independence. Okay, over the years, yeah, we're independent, but the British still kind of are controlling a lot of our affairs, especially with trade. So we'll get there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Peace of Paris, first thing, the British do recognize U.S. independence. Number two, and this is a big deal, the Mississippi River will become the western boundary for this new American country. I'm struggling to figure out because it'll become it's a confederation of states, right? We briefly mentioned the Articles of Confederation. We're gonna talk more about that later on. It is not one country. Okay, and I want to make sure we understand that. The United States of America was really kind of made up of all these different states kind of seeing themselves as their own country. So just as a reminder of that. So the Mississippi River becomes the western boundary. So again, we basically doubled the space of these American colonies, now states. Okay, so Mississippi River becomes the western boundary. It did grant fishing rights to the Americans off of Newfoundland up north, and that might not sound like that big of a deal, but the fishing industry is a major industry, and so this allowed us to basically fish there unmolested and make sure that Americans could enjoy those resources as well. Merchants can collect pre-war debts. Okay, this is going to be one of the major issues leading to the War of 1812. So basically, this is kind of a concession for the British. The British are saying, listen, we had a lot of loans that were given out to Americans, and the Americans say, okay, well, we do understand that, and so you are still allowed to collect those debts. It's not like they're wiped clean. And then finally, the states will restore any confiscated Loyalist property. So, early, we talked about in the causes, especially as the Patriots began ramping up, acts of violence against the British Loyalists, not the British, but the Loyalists in America. We saw a lot of Loyalists run out, okay? And what the British negotiate here is that the states will recognize the rights of those Loyalists for the ones that want to come back. Many of them don't, but they will be restored at this point. With that being said, that is the end of the war. Now, next time, we do have 2 lectures left. Next time, we're going to take a little bit of a look. We're going to step backwards and kind of look at the war from the Canadian perspective. I'll remind you that you are taking IB History of the Americas. This is not an American history class, even though we often focus on the history of America. You need to be able to have perspective from multiple sides within the American continents. So we're going to look at it from the British-Canadian perspective, take 1 lecture to do that, see what's happening up there. And then finally, we'll wrap up and talk just kind of overall the nature of the war, look at, some of the impacts and a little historiography, see, exactly how the war has changed in meaning over time. As always, please email me if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.